Excellent. All right, let me continue real quick. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for our next presentation in the Tribal History Series. This is facilitated, of course, through OKPAN, the Oklahoma Public Archaeology Network, and we're very honored that today Dr. Ian Thompson with the Choctaw Nation here in Oklahoma is here to present. Before we get into all of that, I wanted to quickly just make a statement about the importance of the series and why Paige and I kind of culminated it together to have this. You know, the impetus for this series is to amplify Indigenous voices that have more often than not been excluded or silenced in archaeology and history. So when we do not consider tribes or Indigenous people as those essential partners and knowledge bearers of history, we're leaving out that important cultural component. So I just want you all to kind of think about that, and whatever you do, if you're in education or if you're in archaeology or if you're a student, just think about how important it is to speak with the tribes, and that's why we really are having this series. A few housekeeping things before we do introductions is that the chat is open. So if you want to use that, it's at the bottom of your screen. Please go ahead and chat during the presentation. Just please be respectful, of course, because it will be monitored. So just be respectful, but don't hesitate to use it. Also, the Q&A function is open at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for Dr. Thompson at all during his presentation, go ahead and put them down there. And then Paige and I, at the end of his presentation, will pull from those and hopefully get to as many as we can regarding your questions. So use that. And then also, this is being recorded. I know a lot of you have already gotten the message it's being recorded, but just so you're aware, this is being recorded. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to allow Paige to introduce herself, and then also Dr. Thompson will introduce himself and then start his presentation. So my name is Leanne Wentz, and I am the tribal archaeologist here at the Muskogee Nation in the Historic and Cultural Preservation Department here in Oklahoma. I'm also on the OKPAN Advisory Board. All right, Paige, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Paige Ford. I'm a PhD candidate finishing up here at the University of Oklahoma in the anthropology department. I work in OKPAN as the collaborative partnerships liaison, where my main role is to build relationships with the tribes and also to build programs like this that amplify Indigenous voices and teach people on why working with the tribes is important, especially in archaeology. And of course, I'm also an archaeologist and a researcher. So that's me, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Thompson so that he can introduce himself and start his presentation.
Thank you. Alito, Choctaw Manompa Oklahoma Hachio Panchali. So Chafoya Ian Thompson, Choctaw Michinoholo Sia. Independence, Missouri. I'm a Poatok. Ki Himak Nitok Satichi Amy, Eliti Tokloka Antlers, Oklahoma Bilinka Lashwa. Atako, Oklahoma Choctaw Oklahoma Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Toksalali. Hello everyone, I greet you in the beautiful Choctaw language. My name's Ian Thompson. I'm Choctaw and Euro-American. I was born in Independence, Missouri, and now I reside with my wife Amy near Antlers, Oklahoma. I serve as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. To begin with, thank you, OKPAN. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our history and community. It's exciting to get to do that, so I appreciate the opportunity. As I talk today, I'm going to share a slideshow with you in order to take us places that just my voice alone won't be able to do. So let's pull that up. Are you guys seeing that okay?
Yeah, okay, good.
Thank you. When people think about Native American history, obviously history is in the past, but people tie tribal culture and traditional lifeways and language often to history. So today I'm going to give a holistic presentation. It does talk about our history, but it also talks about it from the perspective of today as the history of a living community, the lifeway of a living community, and the traditional culture of a living community. As such, anything that's alive changes and grows through time. So I'm going to show part of the way that our communities change through time. But that's also true of these aspects of our culture. When you think of the aspects of our culture in that way, it's Choctaw culture, or any tribal culture, is not just something that can be lost or destroyed, but it's something that can be rekindled, revitalized, made anew. So that's the perspective of this presentation. Going back to the beginning, Choctaw history is understood by community members from oral histories that have been passed down from generation to generation. These were part of a specific format that helped to ensure the accurate transmission from one generation to another. And Choctaw history, like the history of many Native American tribes, goes back at least 600 generations in and around our homeland. And it's complex. It talks about many different groups of ancestors. The structure of our oral histories is such that it combines these almost like the palimpsest of the archaeological record. Our oral histories make it sound like like we were one monolithic group moving through time, when actually it was more like a web of interconnected communities. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you hear about our oral histories. According to one Choctaw origin account, the Choctaw and Chickasaw people used to be the same community, and we lived somewhere far in the west. Because of environmental degradation, that became not such a good place to live. So God approached a holy man, and he gave him a sacred pole, Itifabasa, and he told him that the Choctaw and Chickasaw people were to find a new home. And if this medicine person, this holy person, would stick that pole in the ground in the evening, overnight, God would influence that pole so that it would lean in a direction that the Choctaws and Chickasaws would find their new home in. According to some versions of this origin account, they put the pole in the ground every evening for 43 years. And for 43 years, it pointed toward the east. For 43 years, every day, they journeyed in that direction, until eventually the pole remained upright all night at a place on Naniwaya Creek in what's now Winston County, Mississippi, east central Mississippi. For a particular reason, the Choctaw and Chickasaw groups separated there. The folks that became known as the Chickasaw Nation followed one brother named Chickasha. The folks that became known as the Choctaw Nation stayed in that area where the pole had remained upright all night, became the Choctaw Nation. That's the seed of Choctaw culture. There's another origin account, and according to this account, Choctaw people were created in Naniwaya Chilok. It's a cave that you can still see in Winston County, Mississippi. It's located at the base of a natural hill that looks very much like an earth mound. According to this account, several of the southeastern tribes were formed from yellow clay that exists there by God underground, and then they came out to the surface of the earth through the opening of that cave. They sunned themselves on the side of that natural hill. Their skin, it went from being like clay to being like flesh. And those other tribes moved on to different areas. But according to this story, the Choctaw people were created last and came out last and stayed in that area. We were instructed if we remain in that area, we would prosper. And that's also where God handed down our social order to live by. A lot of times there's focus on conflict between tribal oral traditions and archaeology's traditions. But rather than focusing on the conflict today, I think it's interesting to focus on some of the agreements, some of the ways that these different viewpoints talk about the same events. If you look back at Choctaw oral histories, there are many things that are described in them that archaeologists study. Now, Choctaw oral histories don't have calendar dates. It's not tied to a calendar, but many of these events are tied to calendar dates by archaeology. For example, there's several Choctaw stories about interacting with the Pleistocene megafauna. According to these stories, not very long after the Choctaw people emerged as an ethnicity in present-day East Central Mississippi, they interacted with a type of giant animal that traveled in herds. They were larger than anything living today. They were big enough that they were able to eat the lower branches off of the trees, eat off the bark and girdle them and kill them. And according to these traditions, that's what created Black archaeologists didn't believe that Native Americans lived side by side with giant animals from the last ice age. But in the 1920s, archaeology found that, well, in fact, Native American people did live side by side with those animals. And not only that, but hunted them in many cases. There are Choctaw oral traditions that talk about the advent of ceramics. Probably don't have time to go into that today. I can answer it in the questions or talk about it in the questions if you're interested. Archaeology dates the advent of ceramics in the Choctaw Homeland back to about 1500 BC. I was just talking with you about some of the connections between Choctaw people and Naniwaya. That is considered one of the first Choctaw village sites. Besides the cave, there's a large village and earth mound complex there. Archaeology's dated that earth mound complex to around 180. Choctaw oral histories talk about the advent of archery technology. They describe it as a gift from God. They actually connected it with some aspects of the Choctaw afterlife. Archaeology tells us that the bow and arrow came to prominence in Choctaw country around AD 700. Choctaw oral stories talk about the advent of corn agriculture in our area, and that's the importance that had to our community. Archaeology dates that to around AD 1100. So again, to me, it's interesting the different perspectives that archaeology and Choctaw oral tradition use talk about some of the same events from the past. I'll give you a brief summary here. Our ancestors, as I said, and the ancestors of other Native people and Indigenous people from all over the world, not only lived side by side with Pleistocene megafauna, but hunted them. Choctaw Nation considers, Paleo-Indian sites within our homeland of present-day Western Alabama and Eastern Mississippi to be ancestral to us and ancestral to our other Muscogean relatives and some of the other tribes in the area as well. These animals were impressive. I imagine a lot of our viewers are aware of them. The Mastodon stood about 13 foot tall at its shoulder. It was a hairless elephant. The woolly mammoth had hair 3 feet long. There are actually Choctaw words for the woolly mammoth, which is pretty interesting. At this time, there were cave bears, 150% the size of today's grizzly bear, glyptodons the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. So the Choctaw homeland was a different place to walk through in the past, not just because of the animals, but also because of the plant-based ecosystems that existed at that time during the end of the last ice age. The points at the right there are Clovis Points. These went on the end of an atlatl. This is a weapon common to people all over the world, including the Choctaw ancestors. It was used before the bow and arrow. Studies of this weapon have shown that it has better penetrating power than a 30-06 rifle at close range. You can hunt elephants with it. Our ancestors certainly did. Over a vast span of time, our ancestors interacted as Indigenous people with the Choctaw homeland. And that's a unique part of the human experience. Everybody is descended from Indigenous ancestors, but Choctaw people have a unique segment of the human experience within our homeland. And over this length of time, our ancestors developed a fully connected, sustainable type of life way where they gained everything that they needed to live just from the local environments around them. And over more than 14,000 years, they didn't degrade the soils of our homeland. We consider ourselves to be tangentially connected with Poverty Point. Poverty Point is a major World Heritage Site in central Louisiana. It dates back about 1700 BC or so. Through one of the tribes that lived there in that area and subsequently moved into Choctaw country, we do claim some descendancy from Poverty Point. Poverty Point was a society built by very organized people. There are a number of earth mounds there. The one in the picture at the left is an effigy bird mound. It's got something like the equivalent of, don't quote me, but something like 10,000 dump truck loads of soil in it. If you look at it from ground level like this, you don't see that much, but if you look at it from the air, it looks like a bird flying away from Macon Bayou. Archaeology tells us that that entire feature was built in 30 days. You think about the massive amount of work that had to occur, the massive amount of organization, that's pretty impressive. Poverty Point was not an agricultural society. The people at Poverty Point were able to build this society and live in this way just based on their management of local resources around them and the local resources that came from Macon Bayou and from the river network that they were connected with. In Choctaw country, agriculture dates back to about 500 BC or so. This is sometime after the Eastern agricultural complex began in the American Midwest. Our ancestors adopted agricultural plants later on because just our management of the landscapes provided plenty of food and resources that for quite some time it wasn't necessary to go through the annual planting cycle for agriculture. In fact, the first domesticate in the Choctaw homeland wasn't even a food plant, it was the bottle gourd. So that was adopted first, which, contrary to some archaeology theories, it shows that at least for us, agriculture wasn't adopted because of food stress. It was a technological component for us, getting the bottle gourd. Corn agriculture came to prominence around 1100 AD in Choctaw country. We have oral traditions about where corn was domesticated that agree with archaeology. We have oral traditions about where at least some of our ancestors lived when they adopted corn. When this happened, certain parts of the core area of Choctaw Homeland were not suitable for corn agriculture. So some societies moved to other areas. Some of our ancestors moved to places like the Black Warrior River, the Alabama River, interacted with the ancestors of other Muscovian-speaking tribes there. These places were ideal for corn agriculture because of their fertile floodplains and also because they were well connected with waterways for trade. One of the Choctaw names for waterway is Okena, meaning water road. So that talks about the connection that those streams provided. Our lifeway changed in some important ways. Our entire settlement pattern changed around corn agriculture, and many things that people recognize as being Choctaw traditional culture today date back to this time when corn agriculture came to prominence. Europeans first began to sail ships in Mobile Bay in about 1500. Our first face-to-face contact with Spanish conquistadors was in 1521. And this created a number of challenges for the Choctaw ancestors and others. Chief among them was the impact of disease. Colonial diseases came into communities and, quickly depopulated them. There are stories about the first European group that came through the Choctaw Homeland and the American Southeast. They had initially intended to invade the area, but they were overcome by hurricanes, by native warriors being successful against them militarily. And eventually they were down to just a handful of men. And, rather than take revenge on this handful of men, a native community took them in and took care of them. But unfortunately, the conquistadors had some type of a fever that quickly spread through that community and killed half the people in the community and just spread like wildfire from there. Wave after wave of disease hit. And you can think about how much trauma occurred in the United States with coronavirus, for example. That was pretty awful. But the scale of what happened there, less than 1% of our population passed away. But with these diseases that happened back in the 15 and 1600s, many of them would take out 50% of the community. And then a few years later, another one would hit and take out 10% or 20%. So it was quite a struggle that the people who lived at that time overcame. For our ancestors, the way that they overcame it was two-part. One, they moved away from areas where there were navigable waterways that brought in disease. And two, they moved to an area that was less accessible over land, because in the vacuums that occurred because of population loss, European colonies set up a slaving system that was like a second tier of decimation to native communities. By moving away from waterways, by formerly separate Choctaw-speaking groups coming together politically, they were able to give themselves a measure of protection from disease while being large enough to fight off slaving raids when they came. If they could fight off a slaving raid and protect it from burning their crops and their houses, then they had a much better chance of surviving the next wave of disease when it came through. So Choctaw society reorganized. We moved back to an area around Naniwaya from places we had moved during the advent of corn agriculture. Even today, the area around Naniwaya is considered a safe place by a number of Choctaw traditionalists. I'm going to present a little bit about our traditional lifeway in AD 1700. This is when the French first came into Choctaw country. This is when our sustained direct face-to-face contact with Europeans began. So in one way, it's a fully indigenous lifeway that I'm going to show to you, but in another way, it's a lifeway that was already adapted for more than 150 years in response to European diseases and enslaving raids. This picture is of a Choctaw man and woman in winter dress. Everything there is made from the local landscape around them, from the man's buckskin clothing to the lady's turkey feather cape to her skirt that's made out of dog bane and bison wool. This is the Choctaw Homeland through Choctaw Eyes in 1700. The dark areas there, those are Choctaw village sites located in present-day East Central Mississippi. All of the names that are in blue are Choctaw-speaking communities from that time. You can see there was a concentration of Choctaw-speaking communities on Mobile Bay. Eventually, those folks amalgamated with Choctaw Nation proper, so they are our ancestors. The communities listed on this slide in red are our neighbors, they're non-Choctaw speaking. We've got the Choctaw names for them and the literal translations for them there. A lot of those convey a little bit of how Choctaw people perceived our neighbors to be. The colors in the background represent different ecozones within the Choctaw homeland. They all have names in the Choctaw language. It starts on the coast. You have the beaches and estuaries. The dark green, that's the longleaf pine forest. The light green is mixed hardwood forest. The red color is bottomland hardwood forest. And that tan color is prairies. People don't think about the Southeast as having prairies. They don't think about Choctaw country as having prairies. But in fact, there were in some areas, going back to the Choctaw oral tradition that I talked about earlier that connects them with the Pleistocene megafauna. Just a few pictures of what these environments look like when they were managed by our ancestors. Again, our ancestors didn't live in an untouched wilderness. They intentionally managed these areas to support life and produce certain types of resources. There are many different techniques that they use. I don't have time to go into all of those today, but the single most important one was fire, followed by doing things in a cyclical nature, not just obliterating one piece of land through an overabundance of human activity, but cycling those activities through time on the landscape. This is what a hardwood forest looks like managed that way. You can see it's got an open understory with all kinds of diverse plant resources where the sun can hit them underneath the canopy of the trees. This is part of the Black Belt Prairie in the Choctaw homeland. Accounts from the past talk about grass as tall as a man riding horseback. They talk about in the summertime it being a sea of wildflowers blowing in the wind. Going back to the streams, transportation routes, also important places to find raw materials. This is the Black Warrior River, and that pink colored soil in the foreground is one of the best pottery clays we've ever encountered. The longleaf pine forest heading south is basically a pine forest set in a prairie. The understory is a prairie. It's got the second highest ecological diversity outside of the tropics. The bays and gulf are extremely, extremely prolific for shellfish and fish resources. Choctaw society is about balance and duality. So traditionally, the roles of men and women were separated. If anything, women were considered to be more powerful than men because they had the power to create life in their own bodies. Because of this, women were considered to be the foundation of the community. The clan and family line passed through women. Women were the main owners of property in Choctaw society. And women were also the main agricultural producers in Choctaw society. Men's responsibilities complemented those of women. While women had the ability to give life, men had the ability to take life, to protect the community on the battlefield. Unlike women who had this power innately, men had to prove it. So men had to go out and risk their lives on the battlefield to prove that they were worthy of being considered a man in Choctaw society. Besides going to war, men did stickball. Men did most of the hunting. Men did some of the heaviest work in building houses and clearing agricultural fields. Men also served as community leaders, at least in terms of interacting with other external groups. The Choctaw New Year at this time began with the fall equinox. It was a 13-month year based on the lunar system. At the beginning of the year, this corresponds with the nut and acorn harvest in the Southeast. That was a really important food source. So right around the time of the Choctaw New Year, they'd be going out collecting these. The lower right, those are, oh, my mind just went blank, not chinky pins. Yeah, I'll skip that. All right, so at this time of year, the community would go out and they would collect the acorns and the nuts. They would parch them for storage. And then the able-bodied people from the Choctaw towns would head to fall and winter hunting areas. While the older men who had arthritic backs and weren't able to go sleep on the ground in the cold would stay back and they would build families' winter houses. The one on the left there, that's what a Choctaw winter house looked like from the northern part of Choctaw country. On the right, that's a Choctaw winter house, actually a photograph of a Choctaw winter house from the southern area on the Gulf Coast. That one's made out of palmettos there. The winter hunting grounds were located at most about 100 miles from people's towns. The first thing that they would do is find an area where animals were likely to be congregated, probably a place that had been burned within the last year so that there would be fresh plant resources in that area the animals would be coming to eat. Deer was the most important game animal for Choctaw society. These pictures show two different techniques. The upper left, that's a stalking technique aided with a deer decoy. The lower right, that's a communal surround technique where hunters work together cooperatively. The center, that's a deer roast cooking over a fire on a sassafras skewer, which was done traditionally for flavor. The lower left and upper right, that is the laurel greenbrier. It was a food in the wintertime that was processed into bread. That's what you see at the lower left there. Later in the season, communities would conduct a bear hunt down in the river cane breaks. Then people would start coming back to the towns to prepare the agricultural fields. Choctaws had 3 different types of agricultural fields planted at different seasons in the spring. The first of these was the house field planted around the community's houses. The next was the communal field. The communal fields were the main corn, bean, and squash field. They were planted at a time in the season a little bit later when the first fruits in the woods became ripe, like the mulberries that you see at the central picture there. This was so that animal pressure would be lessened on the young crops. This is what Choctaw summer houses look like, pretty variable, but they're designed to keep the rain off and in many cases to allow the wind to blow through for coolness. The agricultural crops were hoed 3 times during the growing season by the women. The community participated together in planting, but thereafter it was the women that took care of the crops. After the first or second hoeing, people would go out to collect a wide abundance of fresh fruits. These are just some of the ones, just a few of the ones from the Choctaw Homeland. Starting at the upper left, we've got maypop, pawpaw, muscadine. Starting at the lower left, possum grapes. The center, that's my wife Amy, she's collecting sand plums. And the lower right, those are blackberries. Blackberries were important enough that there's a month in the Choctaw calendar named after them. Young boys would go out and hunt in the summer. They'd use blowguns to hunt small game. What you see there is a traditional recipe. It's a squirrel that's roasted in an earth oven along with some greenbrier roots, and they're cooked in umbrella palmetto leaves there, or I'm sorry, umbrella magnolia leaves inside the earth oven. After the third hoeing of the crops, they were left to dry, and then the community would go to local wetlands to fish. For the Choctaw communities that lived on the Gulf Coast, shellfish and fish made up a huge part of the diet. Farther inland, they made up a still significant part of the diet, but a little bit less important. The picture at the upper left that shows individuals doing bow fishing. The picture at the right, those are Chickasaw bow fishing arrow points, but they show what Choctaw points would have looked like. The 2 pictures at the bottom are ways that the fish was prepared. The one on the left, the fish is wrapped in plant leaves, tied up tight, coated in clay, put in a fire and burned until the clay cracks, and it steams the fish. The lower right, that's ayabani. That's basically a grill. That same type of apparatus was used in the Caribbean where it was called barbacoa. So this is a connection between Choctaw traditional food and Southeastern traditional food and American barbecue. Stickball was a Choctaw summer sport. It was designed to keep warriors in shape. It was also designed to hone skills of perception, speed, agility, things of that nature. It's still the Choctaw national sport today. The fall harvest occurred in September. Again, the entire community would participate in bringing in the crops. This corresponded with Choctaw Cooking Month. They would take everything out of the stores that had been preserved from the previous year and cook it. So it was a time of abundance because they're making room for the new crops. The picture that you see on the left, that's banaha bread, Alaska banaha in Choctaw. That's a Choctaw national dish. It's kind of like a meatless tamale. On the right, those are women bringing in agricultural produce to the community. They're using pack baskets. That's what it was transported in. Then if you look closely at the left part of that picture, they're processing corn into meal with a kitty, a wooden mortar and pestle, and a fanner basket. Colonization, of course, changed some of these things. Some of these things that I've talked about were already changed because of the impacts of European disease, but face-to-face prolonged contact changed some more things. Eventually the Choctaw land base was reduced by 99.84%. The tribe was split into multiple different communities. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Choctaw tribes, but there are other Choctaw people who are not a part of federally recognized communities, but they're still of Choctaw descent. And this created a number of tragedies including the Trail of Tears. What you see on the right there, those are Choctaw treaty lands, and I don't have our Treaty of Mobile land on there. It goes down to the Gulf Coast, but you can get the idea. And at the left, those are Choctaw treaty lands in Indian Territory, ultimately Oklahoma. Eventually, a significant part of those were ceded to the United States as well. Ceding our land in the east precipitated the Trail of Tears. These are the two Choctaw Trail of Tears routes. The Choctaw were the first tribe in the southeast to go on the Trail of Tears. Choctaw people named it the Trail of Tears. In our language, it's called Hina Nishkin Okchilawa, which basically means Trail of Tears. When Choctaw people left the homeland, or I should say when most Choctaw people did, the ancestors of the Mississippi Band and some other folks were able to stay. But when most Choctaw people left, and when Choctaw people no longer managed the land, an ecological disaster occurred. So this is longleaf pine forest, old growth. You can see the sun hitting the ground under the canopy. This is what happened to that forest. This is the 1920s. This is how it looks today. So obviously it went from a place that had been managed for hundreds of human generations to support life into a place that you couldn't even walk through today. That takes out an important part of culture. We often think about colonization in terms of the loss of life and the loss of land, and it absolutely was, but less often do people think about colonization as one of the most horrific losses of human knowledge in world history. The Choctaw were just one community of 2,000 different languages that were spoken in what's now the Americas. These communities span from small family groups to state level societies. Many of them had extremely deep connections with the land and each other. And through this, they developed specialized knowledge that wasn't necessarily repeated anywhere else in the world. So when these societies were taken from the land and forced to change, it precipitated a loss of knowledge. This is a quote, and actually I don't know if I can read it because the picture screens are in front of it, but you can read this. It's from Chief George Harkins, and this is what he said in a letter to the American people on the Choctaw Trail of Tears. Basically, he hoped that one day there would be a better relationship between the different ethnicities and that peace and happiness would be their reward. The Choctaw Nation has continued to work through that, to work towards them through perseverance ever since the Trail of Tears. The Choctaw Nation didn't go away. We're still here today. One aspect of our tribal government is the Choctaw Nation Historic Preservation Department, and this is where the past meets the future. The Historic Preservation Department has as its mission to protect Choctaw historic sites and sacred sites and to help the community in the revitalization of Indigenous Choctaw culture. In order to we're here to serve the community. And in order to best do that, we work under a preservation plan. This preservation plan begins by going out into the community on a periodic basis and asking them, what their needs are regarding history and culture. We take surveys at all of the community centers, through the tribal newspaper, different places. This is the last one that you did, and you can see the responses that our community had, what they would like us to do. Language and genealogy. Our department does quite a bit with language, but Choctaw Nation has its own language department, so they're obviously in charge of that. We don't do a lot with the second point up there, which is genealogy, but we do collaborate with Choctaw Nation's genealogy program. All of the other points on there just about are things that our office has focused on and made goals for this period covered under the current preservation plan, which is 4 years. And I'll talk about some of those as well as the way that the Historic Preservation Department meets federal standards while still protecting Choctaw history and historic sites and sacred sites in a way that's Choctaw culturally. To do this, we have our department set up into several different programs. One of these is the Section 106 program. The Section 106 program represents Choctaw Nation in consulting with federal agencies on all undertakings that happen within the Choctaw Nation area of historic interest. So each year, our 106 program consults on over 3,000 federal projects within a 9-state area of interest, places where Choctaw people have a historic footprint on the landscape. This is our area of historic interest, and it's based on the very best available information. historic sources, Choctaw place names, archaeological phases that we're tied to, many different things. But occasionally it's a living document. So occasionally, it will change based on new information. Right now, we're particularly interested in our area of interest in the Florida Panhandle. That's an area where we're not currently able to differentiate the archaeological record between what might be ancestral Choctaw and what might be some of the other tribes that live in that area. So as I say, it's a living document and improves through time as we learn more things about our history. Second program is our archaeology program. The archaeology program does for Choctaw Nation what federal archaeology programs do for those federal departments and agencies. Choctaw Nation does a lot of construction projects, and maybe putting in a community center. It may be running a water line or putting in a septic tank for a Choctaw family. Every single one of those, whether it's federally funded or tribally funded, gets reviewed through the Historic Preservation Archaeology Program. The leads for those projects will consult with the state. They'll often consult with other tribes. We consider ourselves to be stewards for the archaeological records of the tribes that are indigenous to southeastern Oklahoma. Folks like the Caddo and the Quapaw and the Osage. We try our best to protect the resources for them and to keep them aware of what's going on and involved in the processes that are happening here that disturb the ground. Our crews go out and conduct archaeological surveys that meet or exceed every federal standard. Sometimes our 106 team gets on to federal agencies because they don't have the archaeological rigor in the reports that they're doing or the survey work that they're doing. And in order to not be hypocritical, we have to meet or exceed those same standards that we expect with federal agencies. So we do. We have a cultural GIS program within the Historic Preservation Department. This program's responsibility is to document Choctaw history on the landscape visually. So they do this by going out and taking points on Choctaw historic sites, Choctaw cemeteries. We have researchers that team up with the GIS program to go through the historical information to find where Choctaw leaders' houses were, find out where battle sites were, where old town sites were. We collaborate with archaeologists and state historic preservation officers to get information about site forms and the sites that we feel are affiliated with Choctaw people, and we put those into the database as well. The layer that you see up here is Choctaw place names, and these are just a few of them. We do dedicated research to go find Choctaw place names on the landscape. Some of these names are still there today in a corrupted form on maps. A lot of them are in historic documents. Some of them are in Choctaw oral histories. We pull all of this information together, and that provides another layer of knowledge about how our ancestors understood and interacted with the land. It's also part of our reviews for Section 106 projects. Besides just looking to see if there are archaeological sites, our team also looks to see if there are Choctaw place names in that area that may indicate some type of a past land use or some type of situation to be aware of when we're trying to prevent those areas from being damaged. Our GIS program also maintains a register of Choctaw historic places. This is all Choctaw historic sites that we know about within our area of interest. There are lots of them. This is linked into a database that we have through Laserfish, so we can keep track of the information about those sites. And then it's tied in with different projects that we do. Like right now, our office is working on an updated map of Choctaw village sites in the homeland and whether those were occupied during the French period or the English period or the American period. And ultimately that will help us to see how our community moved in the late 1600s up through the Trail of Tears, which is informative about how our community interacted with the land, but also how we responded to colonization. Within the archaeology department, we have a cemetery restoration program. The Choctaw Nation Reservation is 10.5 counties in southeastern Oklahoma. At one time, most Choctaw families had individual farmsteads before allotment and after. And many of those farmsteads had their own family cemeteries. For various reasons, people moved away from many of their farmsteads. It may have been the Great Depression, it may have been urban Indian relocation, but people may have just gotten elderly. But many of those are now grown up in weeds and trees, which is what you see on the left there. The cemetery program goes out and they clean those cemeteries. They leave culturally significant plants like the cedar trees. They put permanent fences around the cemeteries, and then they take GPS points on them so that they can go into the database and be protected for the next 100 years if a construction project's going through there. We also help families get access to their family cemeteries if they're landlocked by private land for Oklahoma state laws. Choctaw Nation has a Nagpra program as well, and our Nagpra base is proactive. For years, our office was responding to Nagpra in an entirely reactive way, and we still do sometimes. It's necessary for inadvertent discoveries and things of that nature. But this program is proactive, so the staff are just going state by state, and in each state they contact every single federal repository and send them not just a letter inquiring about their Nagpra collections, but also another letter inquiring about any Choctaw cultural objects that they may have. The Nagpra process, of course, follows from there, but then for the cultural objects, if they do have them, Choctaw Nation has created an Impona database that documents our traditional arts. If these museum collections are willing, we'll take photographs and measurements of them and put them on a website. And then Choctaw tribal members anywhere in the country can see those objects. They may live there locally and can go see them in person. There may be someone who, for instance, is interested in revitalizing Choctaw archery bows. So they can get on there and look at a collection of bows from all over the world that are Choctaw and see similarities and measurements and that type of thing. The final program within historic preservation is research and outreach. And this is how through all of these programs, we interact with our community, but this is one of the programs that helps us make sure through the period between preservation plans that we're still following the community's wishes. We have a community liaison that goes out to community centers. They do archaeological site tours. With COVID, they've been doing, our liaison's name is Joe Wolf. He's been doing a series called On the Go Joe on Facebook, where he'll visit these different Choctaw historic sites that are protected and interpreted them for the community that until recently hasn't been able to get out to see them on tours. This program writes a monthly column for the tribal newspaper about Choctaw history and culture. It started out like a Dear Abby Choctaw culture and history column, and now it's evolved into other things. For example, currently there's a 1.5-year series going on that interprets every 10 years of Choctaw history after removal, the major things that were going on in the community during each decade. This program, as well as the other programs in the department, give a number of presentations, work on a number of videos. We've got a Facebook video page with dozens and dozens of videos on it that we can direct people to when they contact us with questions about certain aspects of Choctaw history or culture. It's particularly helpful for our community that doesn't live in southeastern Oklahoma and maybe can't make it to some of the face-to-face programs. With COVID, this program set up the Tasholi Speaker Series. It's a virtual presentation that happens once or twice a month. They feature a Choctaw elder or cultural person or Choctaw scholar, and they talk about different aspects of Choctaw history or culture, and then they answer community members' questions. The research and outreach program, as well as some other programs within the department, also go out and do a variety of classes in the community. As you can see from what I've been talking about, the different programs in the department work together to concentrate their effort in a way that creates results that's greater than just the sum of the parts. So I'd like to share a few of the different joint projects that they do. There are many aspects of Choctaw history and culture that have no visual representations. We just know about it from oral history, or we know about it from historical writings. But of course, the picture is worth 1,000 words. And there are a lot of pictures out there that purport to show Choctaw culture, but they do it inaccurately. So we work together with historical researchers, with the archaeology program, and we contract with community members who are gifted in doing drawings. And then we work together to create drawings that portray Choctaw culture in accurate ways that have not been done before. So you may remember from the map I showed you earlier, there was a concentration of Choctaw speaking ancestral Choctaw settlements on Mobile Bay. And one of their main food resources was shellfish. So this is a depiction showing what it was like at one of those shellfish camps, going out collecting the fish, roasting them on the coals, stringing them on a line, and then smoking them over a smoke pit. And that also ties in with what you would see archaeologically. Even the dwellings in the background tie in with some sketches we've seen of Choctaw houses from the Mobile area. We get sketches like this, and then we use them in presentations like my current one, or also in the cultural center, also going out into the community, answering researchers' questions, that type of thing. Each year, at least before COVID, we did the Indigenous Immersion Camp. With this, we invite the community to nominate Choctaw youth who they think will be future cultural leaders. There's no application for the camp. Kids only come because they're nominated by elders or cultural people. We have about 10 or 12 participants each year. They range in age from sophomore in high school to early college age. The first few days, we help them think about what it means to be Indigenous, what it means to have a uniquely Choctaw Indigenous connection with the land. We take them out on the land in southeastern Oklahoma and teach them basic skills about what it means to interact with the land. They're mentored by an elder Native man, an elder Native woman for certain parts of that. They do a variety of cultural activities, like deep cultural stuff, more than you could just get at like a day camp. It's a deep kind of stuff. And then we take them to the homeland after they've learned something about the land in southeastern Oklahoma. And we don't just take them to anywhere in the homeland, but we take them to Choctaw sacred sites, archaeological sites. And we have a partnership with Mississippi National Forests, where we take the youth to places where the landscape is being managed as it was 200 years ago. So rather than just seeing the land as it is today, a sick, degraded condition, they can interact with the same plants and animals that our ancestors did on a landscape that looks very much like it did before the Trail of Tears. And then, obviously there's a lot that we do in that 8 days with these folks. They stay in contact after that. And many of them are emerging as cultural leaders for sure. After several years of this camp, we're seeing them mature. Several of them work for the Choctaw Cultural Program. One of them works for the Historic Preservation Department now. So it's a cycle. They're becoming the cultural leaders and the teachers of the next generation. Historic Preservation has worked with the community to revitalize a number of Indigenous traditional arts. These are important locus between culture and history. One of those is traditional pottery. We have a fully alive, active traditional pottery community now, making pottery the same way that our ancestors did and cooking and eating out of it. We've got a Choctaw Textiles group that was organized by our department, and they did a major project to recreate a Choctaw Athkona. That's a traditional woman's skirt made out of drop spindle spun bison wool and dogbane fibers that have been twined together. So that's part of this group here with their textile in front of them. This ultimately has been put on display in the Choctaw Cultural Center, and it's the first one that's been seen in many generations. Our department has taught brain tanning classes or egg tanning classes. This is one of those. The hides that were produced were then used for different cultural projects, such as covering the life cast figures in the Choctaw Cultural Center with clothing. These hides were provided to different Choctaw artists to make those things. For many years, we've done Flint Mapping classes with youth. It's a group of Flint Nappers there on the right-hand side. Those are points made from stone from the Choctaw Homeland. We have an agreement with the Mobile District Army Corps of Engineers to go gather resources each year, including the exact same types of stone that our ancestors used for stone tools. We heat treat it traditionally underground with a fire on top, and then use antlers to shape it, all part of the class and reconnecting with our culture, particularly for males, but females enjoy it too. We have a Growing Hope program that was funded by a grant. It's getting ready to transfer over fully to the Historic Preservation Department. This program has gone out and collected Indigenous Choctaw seeds, cultivars, things our ancestors have grown for centuries. Many of these are highly, highly threatened. Some of them, they're literally just 5 or 6 seeds, so they've been growing those out so that they don't go extinct, getting enough grown out to give to community members who may want to grow them. This one here is really interesting. On the left, that's a bottle gourd that comes from an archaeological site, actually a mound site in Mississippi, and somehow it just survived on its own out there for 500 years. Nobody planted it. those seeds were, that gourd on the left was given to us, and we planted out the seeds, and that's them right now. That's how they looked yesterday. That's a 500-year-old bottle gourd variety that's growing out through this program right now, hopefully to produce more seeds. These are field peas. The one at the left, that's a variety my family brought from Mississippi back in the 1800s. These are probably the program too. And then through all the research that historic preservation has done and interaction with elders, we've learned about, just one second. Through all this, we've learned about the traditional food preparation implements that our ancestors made, and many of these, like pottery, are being actively revitalized, basketry, etc. So we can produce our traditional foods exactly like they used to be. This is a connection between culture and quality of life. You know, many of the most serious issues that our community faces result from the foods that we eat: obesity, stroke, diabetes. We suffer these things at a higher rate than any other segment of the American population. Our indigenous foods are an antidote to that. And they're beautiful, they're flavorful, they're the basis for several major types of American cuisine, but in many ways they have more flavor and nutrition than those modern versions do. One thing that we're focusing on increasingly is land management. You know, it's difficult to have traditional culture if you're on a landscape that's been completely degraded. So we've been learning more about how our ancestors managed the land and interacted with specific ecosystems on a broad level. The Historic Preservation Department, you know, we exist to serve our community. We have many partnerships within the community. We also have partnerships within the Choctaw tribal government. Wheelock Academy Historic Site. There's a museum out there run by Choctaw Nation. We do many activities for school groups, community groups out there. The Oklahoma Capitol Museum is the Choctaw Nation Capitol from 1883. Each year we do a lot of different activities out there, including help to sponsor a living village at the Choctaw Labor Day Festival. The lower left, that's the Choctaw Nation Cultural Center. Historic Preservation has been working closely with the Cultural Center to create content for the past 3 years. That will be opening on July 23rd. So we're really excited for the community to come in and see what people think of it. And then we interact with many other Choctaw programs as well, things like youth outreach, backyard gardening project. You know, the opportunities are almost endless. So that is about 14,000 years of Choctaw history from a 21st century perspective in 52 minutes or less. Here's my contact information, and I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to start with a question. This is Paige talking. If you can't see me, I don't know if you can or not. So first of all, I want to thank Dr. Thompson, of course, for giving, that was an amazing presentation with a lot of information. And it was so interesting and very well delivered. So I'm going to start off the questions with a question that I have for everyone that is going to be giving a presentation in our series. And want to ask, especially as a graduate student, as other folks who work in archaeology, anybody who's interested in archaeology, Dr. Thompson, why do you think, from your perspective, why is it important for archaeologists to learn the histories, work with the tribes, and to foster relationships with the tribes?
Well, archaeologists by nature are curious people. You know, they're people who want to learn something new, experience something that maybe someone hasn't experienced in centuries. The best way to learn about the past is to interact with people who possess the cultures that are connected with that past that you're studying. You know, if you're studying Moundville, if you're studying Hopewell, if you're studying many of these archaeological sites, you know, those cultures aren't dead. You know, they've changed like anything that's alive, they've grown, but they're still existing today in the form of Native American tribes and the people that hold those cultures. So if you want to learn about them, one of the best ways is to interact with people who are part of those communities. You know, beyond that, obviously, then if you're an archaeologist, I would think that you would want your work to have as much meaning as possible. archaeology done in a vacuum or just for other archaeologists, it's debatable how much social benefit that really has. However, if you're an archaeologist that's tied in with the descendant community and focusing your research to address questions that descendant community may have, questions that may be extremely pertinent to quality of life or even people's longevity or health. I can't think of a way that archaeology could possibly be more relevant than that.
Yeah, that was a good question and a great answer, Dr. Thompson. We have a couple of questions regarding books and things that, what is the Choctaw Nation seen from like ethnographers? And this one specifically asked about an assessment of Patricia K. Galloway's Choctaw Genesis from 1500, 1700. Are things that you've read, and because I know you've read a lot and Choctaw Nation has gone through a lot, and there's tons of books and articles, just like with any tribe, written about them, and they rarely ever talk to the tribes, as you were just kind of alluding to. So, what would be the best way besides reaching out? Are there any books that you would recommend for people to look at that may have got some things right regarding Choctaw history?
Sure. So of course, the best way is to reach out to Choctaw Nation. And we have a website, choctawnationculture.com. We even have a YouTube page with more than 100 videos that we consider to be culturally accurate. Those are great places to learn. We've got an archive of like 10 years of Iti Fabasa articles that we've written on Choctaw history and culture. That's a fantastic resource. You can look to books written by Choctaw people. Like if you want a really traditional Choctaw view of the past, the book Choctaw Nationalism by Dr. Kenneth York is probably the best. Dr. York is a traditional Choctaw historian from Mississippi with all kinds of Choctaw cultural insights, and he investigates the past from that perspective. Dr. Galloway's book, Choctaw Genesis, she's obviously done a tremendous amount of research into Choctaw history and culture. I was probably in grade school or junior high when that came out, so I'm not sure what the interaction with the community was. But Dr. Galloway is available to us now. She's been willing to share information. We've collaborated on some stuff. We appreciate that interaction with her. Similarly, Dr. Greg O'Brien is an ethno-historian like Dr. Galloway, and he and Choctaw Nation work together quite often on many things. He has a lot of insight into Choctaw culture. Dr. Joe Watkins is a Choctaw tribal member. He's previously an archaeologist for the Choctaw Nation. He's recently been the president for the Society of American Archaeology. He has a book called Indigenous Archaeology that's fantastic. And then there are many other authors, both Choctaw and not, that give some insight into different pieces of the story. But really the main thing I would suggest is to come to Choctaw Nation and the resources that we have that we could share with you.
Amazing. Yeah, and I encourage anybody that has, some specific questions to definitely reach out to Dr. Thompson using his contact information. There's a couple of questions here that are asking specifically about how to start a working relationship with the tribes, as well as what the tribes, or in this case, Choctaw Nation, want to see from federal agencies, as well as graduate students working in archaeology and otherwise. So how to foster those relationships and get a good working relationship with the tribes.
So there are many different types of relationships that could happen and that could be beneficial to the entities that you've talked about, as well as to descendant communities. But the key in all of these is getting to know people on a personal level. So, whether you're a student or an agency official or an archaeologist in the field, find ways to connect with tribal entities on topics of mutual interest. Maybe that's going to SEAC and interacting with speakers on the Nagpra panel or tribal archaeologists that may be there. It doesn't always have to start out as formal contact. It can start out as person-to-person contact, or it can start out as formal contact. I found that in many instances with federal agencies, there's a certain formula that's laid out in the law, in order for the federal entity to maintain its trust responsibility with tribes. And that's certainly important. But when you're talking about, for example, consultation under the National Historic Preservation Act, the way to do that most effectively is to have a relationship that's built on trust between the tribe and the federal agency. And you could say the same thing with the archaeologist or the student. Ultimately, you have to have a relationship that's built on trust. And that comes through contact and knowing each other on a human kind of level, not just through the formalities of the law.
All right, I'm gonna wrap it up with kind of one last question, but first I just want to say that also Dr. Thompson has his own book, Choctaw Food: Remembering the Land, Rekindling Ancient Knowledge. It's a great read. I know he's not going to say it, but I'm going to put it out there because it is really interesting. He did a lot of research for it, so you should definitely check out that book as well. And also, Ian, we've had a couple questions just about the new cultural center. Can you briefly just talk about the new cultural center that Choctaw Nation has?
Absolutely. It's located in Durant, Oklahoma, just off of Highway 75. It's set up in such a way that it's our community talking directly to folks that come in. It's our community telling its own story. There's no third-party narrator. There's no archaeological double speak, if you want to use that word. It's all the community talking to people, and there are many exciting things in it. One that I'll share is that the main exhibits are called Choctaw Noa Aya, the Choctaw Journey, and they follow the Choctaw community through time in a way that ties back to a cycle. Part of this is a series of landscapes, dioramas, and they have life cast figures in them. Each of these life cast figures from different periods in Choctaw history have complete, exact, perfect casts of community members' faces. It looks exactly like them. And then they're clothed in clothing that was made by the community, traditional artists from different time periods. More than 40 Choctaw artists collaborated together to create those. There's a restaurant that features traditional food. There's a living village. There's a traditional garden. Just many, many opportunities to come learn and enjoy some time with the Choctaw community.
Amazing. Well, we won't keep you too long, Dr. Thompson. We appreciate it. I know I appreciate it. I know Leanne appreciates it. You giving a presentation and teaching us about Choctaw history and taking some time to answer people's questions. Again, everyone that's listening, if you have more questions, definitely reach out to Dr. Thompson. And if you have questions about the series as we go forward, we're going to continue on with our series later on. And just keep going with as many of our participants as we have. And if you have questions about that, you can reach out to Leanne and myself. Our contact information should be in the email that you received with your Zoom link. Once again, we recorded this. It will be up on OKPAN's YouTube, the Oklahoma Public Archaeology Network. If you search for that on YouTube, you can find it pretty easily, and the video will be up at some point in the future for viewing after we have a chance to give it to Dr. Thompson for his review. So we thank you again, Dr. Thompson, so much, and we'll see everybody for the next one. Be on the lookout for announcements.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Did an excellent job as usual.
Amazing job. All right.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
All right. Bye.
Everybody.